Thank you very much. This is my first time in Riga, and I already feel at home here because this is one of the few places I've been speaking in countries, many different countries around the world as the book has come out in different languages, and it's not usually the case that I can come to a country that's smaller than Israel. It's a very nice experience for me, and I think actually we're going to be speaking about this, about what small countries have in common, and actually how important this is, and how this is actually an asset, not a liability. But and I also felt at home with the first speech and the second speech, talking about planning, about lack of planning or planning. Israel is a country where we think planning is when we are looking ahead till next week. We're not a country that has done a lot of planning. We sometimes try. It's not very successful. One of the countries I traveled to recently was Singapore. That's a country that plan goes from plan to plan, decides it's going to create whole industries and does that. That's a thing that we can admire in Israel, but we could never do. We're on the other side of the spectrum. We improvise, we make it up as we go along, and that has advantages as well. So I want to start out by what is Startup Nation? Why did we call it Startup Nation? Well, this map here, this is a screenshot from a website called mappedinisrael.com. It shows some of the startups in the Tel Aviv area, some of the co-working spaces, venture capital funds, and so on. And this is why we call it Startup Nation, because there are more startups in Israel than anywhere outside of Silicon Valley. And perhaps more important, in terms of measuring the success of these startups, is the amount of venture capital that they've received. A lot of these startups kind of come and go. We don't even know that they exist before they disappear. A number of the ones we wrote about in the book have already failed, disappeared. Other ones we hadn't thought of have come up. That's the way it goes. But one measure of an innovation sector is venture capital, whether these startups are able to attract outside investment. And Israel is now receiving about 2.5 times as much venture capital per capita as the United States, about 30 times as much as Europe on average, again per capita, not in absolute terms, though even in absolute terms, Israel is as much or more than the major European countries like Germany and the UK in terms of venture capital. So this is really what made us decide that we needed to write a book about this. There was something important that needed to be explained here. So what I'm going to talk about, if I can figure this work. How do I go to the next one? Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to try to talk about these things, maybe not in exactly this order, we'll see. But the first thing is, of course, what makes Israel innovative. The second, what makes countries innovative. The third part may have to go to the questions about some ideas for entrepreneurs. And the fourth part is very interesting and important, I think, context for us, as for every country, is where the world of innovation is going. Now, we need, though, to start with a myth about innovation. We actually think that innovation is about ideas. And you can see this because if you put the word innovation into Google Images, these are the pictures that will pop up. I just pulled these from Google Images when you're searching for the word innovation. Lots of light bulbs, because we think of innovation as ideas. The symbol of the idea is the light bulb, so that's the symbol of innovation. Now, there's a problem with that idea, is that ideas are really not the most important part of innovation. We all have ideas. Lots of countries have ideas. If you look at the numbers of patents in the world, the top countries in patent density, patents per capita, Israel's among those countries, but there are countries that have more patents per capita in many areas. And yet, if you compare these top countries in patents, Israel has many more startups than those other countries. So the other countries are getting the ideas, but they're not getting the startups, which shows that it's not just about ideas. So first question is that innovation is not just about ideas. The second is that we think of innovation as being about technology. And this is very true, especially in Israel. Israel is a very tech-heavy country. This is an advantage for us, and it's also a disadvantage. Actually, technology is not as important as most people would think for innovation. It's really one component, just like the idea is one component. The technology is just one component. I mean, think of a company like Facebook. Did Mark Zuckerberg invent the technology? No. Google, yeah, there's an algorithm in there somewhere. But the essence of it is technology is part of it. It's built on technology. Even an iPhone, Apple. There's lots of technology there, but what makes Apple different than other companies is not necessarily the technology, really. They would like to say it is. But it really is about the magic that they add to it, the design, the marketing, the aura that Apple has managed to build around itself. And that's not technology. So innovation is not technology either. So what is innovation? We think that there's something that comes out of Israel that helps explain this, what innovation is, kind of from the Israeli experience. And that is that there are really two big ingredients that you have to add to ideas to get innovation. The first is what we call drive. A drive is just one word for it. There are a lot of words for it. Determination. In the book we talk about chutzpah, that funny word that means brash or audacious. It means the craziness of a startup that thinks it's going to change the whole world. Everybody is doing one thing one way, and a few people, young people, are going to come along and with a better idea, and everyone is going to move to that idea. That's chutzpah. That's drive. That's determination. And the third additional ingredient is a willingness to take risks. And that's critical because many of you here, I'm sure, are entrepreneurs, are in business of some kind or another. And anyone who is an entrepreneur knows that there are two big things that happen as an entrepreneur. You come up with that idea, like everybody else, you've got a great idea. But what makes you different is you really believe in that idea so much that when you tell everybody your idea and everyone says it's a crazy idea, it's a stupid idea, that's what happens when you're an entrepreneur. The first thing, everybody reacts to new ideas by saying it's not a good idea. That's the general reaction to a new idea. And what makes the entrepreneur different is they don't care. They just keep going. They have that drive. And the second thing that everyone will tell that entrepreneur is, don't do it. Don't do a startup. It's too risky. Most startups fail. And they're certainly right about that. Most startups fail in Israel. Most startups fail in Silicon Valley. Most startups fail everywhere. And the entrepreneur goes ahead anyway. So the real question of the book became, where does Israel get those two additional ingredients? Where do we get a little more drive, a little more determination, a little more willingness to take risks, maybe than other countries? And there are three big factors. We talk about 7 or 8 different factors in the book, but there's 3 factors I'd like to mention. The first is that Israel itself is a startup. These are kids founding a kibbutz in Israel in 1948. Israel started with a crazy idea that most people would say wouldn't go anywhere. It took a lot of drive and determination to make that idea a reality. It took a lot of willingness to take risks to make that idea a reality, not just 100 years ago or 60 years ago, but continuously through our history. So what's happened in Israel is that without really realizing it or understanding it, Israelis are born into an environment where they understand that you have to be somewhat driven and willing to take risks for there to be a country around you in the first place. It's kind of baked into the history and culture of the country. And I have to say that here in Latvia, I think that you, with your history, you have some of that you don't take your existence necessarily for granted. You have been buffeted about by the huge neighbors on either side of you, and you haven't always had your independence, and you fought a lot for your independence. So you also don't take your independence and your existence for granted. So you know that feeling that we have. Now, another big area that people is very surprising, I think, to people, is that we have this thing in Israel called the military, and most people, when they think of the military and innovation, first of all, they don't think of those two things together at all. You know, that's like the least innovative place they can find. And of course, in Israel, Israelis also complain about all the bureaucracy, and they don't think of the military as necessarily an innovative place. But then they think, okay, so how can the military be connected to innovation? Well, maybe it's about technology that's developed in the military and spills over into civilian stuff. And yes, that happens. It's true that some of these technologies turn into startups, related to security, related to all kinds of things. But most of the startups in Israel are not security related. Ag tech is huge, biotech is huge, clean tech is huge, nanotechnology. A lot of it's not related directly to military technology. And also, we'll talk about this later, but Israel spends 4.5% of its GDP on civilian research and development. That's almost twice the OECD average. That's not counting the military R&D. So that's not the answer either. And we also, in the book, I think people who start learning a bit about Israel, they learn that there are particular units that are very high-tech oriented, that produce a lot of people who go into high-tech. They're very interesting units. One's called the 8200 unit, an intelligence unit, the Air Force, and so on. And that's part of the story. It's very interesting. But that, too, is not really, we think, the most important impact of the military. We actually think the biggest impact is this, that it's become a third stage in life. There's 3 stages in life. In most countries, you have school and you have work. For Israelis, there's school and the army and work. This third stage in life that comes in there, 3 years for men, 2 years for women. And Israelis get things that they don't normally get in school or in work, like leadership, teamwork, how to work as a team. Really important. You don't learn that in school. You don't always learn it in work. Sacrifice. You're 18 years old, 19 years old. You think the world is all about you, and you realize that there's something more important than you in the world. You have to sacrifice yourself for your unit, for your country. You have to work towards a larger goal that's more important than you. And I would say probably the most important value that comes out of the military or skill is what I would call mission orientation. The main thing they teach you in the military is not really about technology or whatever it is you're doing. It's really what a mission is. A mission is something that has to get done, that people's lives depend on it. It's very important. You have to succeed, but on the other hand, you have to take risks. And how do you balance the need for success with the need to take risks? And this is the fundamental dilemma that entrepreneurs and business people of all kinds are dealing with all the time. And it's something that Israelis are trained in the military. They come out of the military mission-oriented. They know what a mission is, and a startup is a mission. And a startup or any kind of business the whole thing is a mission, and it's made up of missions. You have to get things done. And so it's very, very important for this story. The third factor I'd like to talk about is immigration. We're a country of immigrants. This has been very, very important for us. Why? Because immigrants are natural entrepreneurs. They naturally have both of these two elements that I talked about earlier. They were driven enough to move from one country to another. They were willing to take a risk when they moved from one country to another. So it's really not surprising that in many places, immigrants are the entrepreneurs. We know this around in Europe, in Asia, in the U.S. I mean, in Silicon Valley, something like half of the companies were started by immigrants in Silicon Valley. So immigrants are kind of self-selected wherever they go to be entrepreneurs. And Israel is a country of immigrants. Everyone there, almost, is either themselves an immigrant or their parents or their grandparents. So it's a country that works very hard to absorb its immigrants. That's an important part of it. And has an immigrant mentality, which I think helps us be more entrepreneurial. So what makes countries innovative? So this is what a lot of countries think makes countries innovative. This is a tech park. Countries, when governments think about how to become more innovative, they tend to think about two things. One of them is, let's build a tech park. And tech parks are beautiful. They're great things. They are really great for corporates, for big companies that, you want to bring an Oracle or an Intel or whatever, and you need to put them in a nice tech park. And of course, those kind of big companies are very important for an innovation ecosystem. So I'm not denying the importance of corporates and tech parks, but I would say that if you want startups, this isn't usually going to help, because the startups don't really like to be in tech parks. That's not where you usually find them. So when it comes to startups, this doesn't really help. Now, another thing that countries tend to think of when they think, okay, we've got to become more innovative, is they think we really need to okay. So there we go. We really need to increase our R&D spending. We're only spending 1% of our GDP on R&D. We got to get that up to 2% or whatever. And yeah, it's true. Israel spends 4.5% of its R&D, of its GDP, on R&D, which is huge. But that's not because the Israeli government is so brilliant. They never sat down and decided, we're going to spend that much on R&D. The reason Israel spends that much is we have so many R&D centers. We have hundreds of major companies Google, Microsoft, Intel, IBM has bought something like 12, 13 companies, Cisco, another, 10 companies. There's hundreds of these, the who's who of technology, slowly from other parts of the world like Samsung and Huawei and, British Telecom is big, Siemens is involved. There's lots of international companies, mainly from the United States, but increasingly from other parts of the world. And the combination of all these thousands of startups and these hundreds of major R&D centers, that's what produces the high R&D spending, not the other way around. It's a product of a healthy innovation sector. It's not, doesn't come from the R&D spending. So it's hard to get an innovation sector by trying to increase R&D spending. So how do you do this? How do you become more innovative? So the secret is actually more in places like this. Here's a coffee shop on Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv. This is the kind of place where startups like to be. You all know places like this where everybody's got their laptops open and is working on something. And I mean, think about where those laptops are open, where all those people are sitting doing startups. They're basically doing in the cool neighborhoods. That's where they want to be. That's where all of us want to be. We want to be sitting in a place, in a nice coffee shop, in a lively part of the city where there's stuff going on. So it's the most up and coming, often not the fanciest part. Usually it's a part that's kind of more run down, like in London, the part of town where most of the startups are, they're calling it Silicon Roundabout, is an area of town that's between the main part of the city and the Olympic Park. It was kind of a lost part of town. But that's where, because the rents were cheap and there were, I guess, good restaurants and things, that's where the startups gravitated to. And the City of London actually did something smart. Instead of building another tech park, they simply drew a circle around that part of town and they said, this is Tech City. We're going to call this Tech City. So they kind of just went to where the startups were organically coming up. And that's a nice lesson. That's a good way to do it is, again, I think you want to promote innovation, pay attention to where the startups are coming up organically and try to draw a circle around that, try to accelerate that, try to encourage that in whatever way you can, which is usually more a matter of being helpful rather than spending a lot of money. So that's where you'll find the startups. Now, I want to talk about what makes people innovative and what makes countries innovative together. We know this about people. We know that people are different. We know that when we try to build a startup or a big company, that the way to do it is not to collect a lot of people who are identical. If you're looking for a partner in a business, you don't want to get someone just like yourself. You want to get, or let's say you're an investor and you're looking at startups. What kind of startup are you going to invest in? Well, all investors say we don't look at the business plan. We look at the team. We want to see someone who's great at technology, another one's great at business, another one's great at marketing, another one's great at design. We want to see a team of really strong people that complement each other, that are built on their differences. So we know this when it comes to people, we know it when it comes to companies, but we don't really think this way enough when it comes to countries. Countries are also different. Countries, like people, have strengths and weaknesses. And the hard part of this is that we're not aware of our own strengths. We're kind of blind to our own strengths. I find this in Israel as well. For example, in Israel, Israelis are Shimon Peres, the president of Israel, used one word to describe Israelis that we use in the book. He said, Israelis are dissatisfied. They're always think that there's a better way to do things, and they're always complaining about the way things are, and they want to do things better. Now, so the big complaint that Israelis have about themselves is they say, why we only do startups? Why can't we build big companies? Where's our Facebook? Where's our Instagram? In the book we talk about where's our Nokia, actually, for many years was what Israelis said, because Nokia was a symbol for Israelis of a huge successful technology company coming out of a small country. So Israelis complain. They say, why, we're only good at startups. And I've been traveling around the world, and I wish Israelis could see this, because everywhere I go, they say, where are our startups? Why can't we do startups? They don't even say, why can we do big companies? They assume they can do big companies. They assume that they can build companies that we can only dream of. Like when I was in Spain, of course, they're complaining about the lousy economy, the high unemployment, about all kinds of things. They're not entrepreneurial. They don't like to take risks, and so on. Meanwhile, I go back to Jerusalem, and to go into Jerusalem, you drive underneath a beautiful bridge designed by Calatrava, the Spanish architect. We go shopping in Mango and in Zara. Spain builds huge construction and real estate and all kinds of businesses that we could only dream of. We have no idea how to do things like that. But in Spain, they don't realize those are strengths. They don't realize that not everybody can do that. So we really have to learn how to kind of understand our own strengths, identify our own strengths, and build on them. There we go. So we'll get back to that more as we go on. But I want to talk some about where the geography of innovation is going. Now this, basically in 1950, there was only one innovation center in the world, and that was Silicon Valley. It was the beginning. Now, the Silicon Valley has a long history. Hewlett-Packard, the anchor company of Silicon Valley, was founded in 1939. Intel, for example, was founded in 1968. So Silicon Valley has been coming up over the last 50, 60 years and has become the core innovation sector of the world. And for many years was basically the only innovation sector. And then, we started coming online around 1990, this little kind of offshoot almost of Silicon Valley, of a place that was developing technology that was, if you look at Intel, for example, Israel, many of the chips made by Intel, they're in your computers, going way back to the 386 chip, if anybody can remember that. In fact, even the original 888 chip was designed partly in Israel. The 386 was designed and built in Israel. The Pentium, also the Centrino. A fascinating story in the book about how Israel was was a critical part of Intel and many other companies. So Israel actually became a place that was developing some core technologies that ended up in your computers, in your mobile phones, in lots of things through big American companies. And we started becoming a kind of satellite innovation center of the world. And then something amazing is happening right now. And this has really struck me personally as I've been traveling around the world. Everywhere I go in the last few years, there are startups coming up. And we're moving into a world that's more like this. And this is really very, very important for us to understand for all of us to understand. Even Israelis, I think, don't fully get this, that we Israelis are very Silicon Valley, American market oriented. And we need to understand that the world of innovation is about to explode. That within the next decade, we're going to see major innovation centers in every part of the world. And what's exciting about this time that we're in is we don't know where they're going to be. We don't know who's going to be the leader in Asia. We don't know whether, Vietnam is going to be huge, or whether Thailand is going to be huge, or whether it's going to be Korea, or, or in Africa, is it going to be Kenya, or is it going to be South Africa? In Israel shows that it's not necessarily the biggest country. We're in the ball game, even though we're a tiny country. You wouldn't necessarily predict, based on our size, the size of the economy and so on, that Israel would be an innovation leader. And the same goes, I think, for Europe, for South America, for Africa, for Asia, is that there are going to be major innovation centers in each area, and we don't know who they're going to be. The game is on for all of us, I think, and it can be anyone. And I think for us to become innovation centers, we have to be aware of this world. We have to be aware that the world is shifting from a place where everything comes from Silicon Valley, which is we don't realize how much we think everything comes from Silicon Valley, because it's clear why we think that, because the major companies that are defining us, defining the world of tech and innovation now, there are basically 5 companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, Intel, Microsoft. They're all from that little part of the world. But that's not the world going forward. That's not going to be the world 10 years from now. The world going forward is going to have innovation coming from all over the place. I just picked a bunch of random examples. Of course, we know Skype from around here. Angry Birds are also from around here, from Finland. Waze is from Israel, was just bought by Google for $1 billion, a navigation thing. This is just a few random startups that coming from Israel, just to give you an idea of things. Basically, what I want to illustrate here are startups that came from any of these startups. They became or are becoming global. They're tackling global problems, but where they come from is random. Why did Skype have to come from Estonia? Why did Angry Birds have to come from Finland? It could have come from anywhere. Why did Waze have to come from Israel? Orcam is this new little startup that's using computer vision to help blind people read. Like they can walk around the street and they can read a bus, the number on the bus, or the sign, or a newspaper, or a bottle of medicine. Takadu is the thing that's taking municipal water systems, applying software algorithms, and finding 30 to 50% of water just leaks out of our municipal water systems, and it's finding those leaks just with software. Biogaming is a little place that is using games like Wii and Kinect to do physiotherapy. So it's much more effective. It's much more fun. Kids can do it. It doesn't hurt so much because you're playing a game. So it's like a huge breakthrough in physiotherapy. Farmigo is this little company that's connecting farmers directly to consumers. Because people want to buy fresh food. They don't want to pay all these middle people. The farmer wants to make more money. Instead of losing 80% of the money along the way, they can keep 80% by selling direct to the consumer. And this is basically applying software to the whole issue of food. MindLab. This to me is a critical thing. A company that most people haven't heard of, even in Israel, and I think is revolutionary. It's reinventing education by teaching things that you don't normally learn in school, like strategic thinking, decision making, emotional intelligence, and it's teaching them through games. And this coming year, there are going to be 1 million kids in Brazil who are using this system, this MindLab system. And to me, actually, this is a beautiful example of combining the strengths of different countries. Why? Because, you know, that little Israeli startup that came up with a brilliant idea back in the 90s basically would still be nowhere right now. They might have been out of business by now. Except what happened was a guy from Brazil found them and said, "This is amazing, I want to take it to Brazil." And the Brazilian was the one who figured out how to get into the Brazilian school system. That's a business problem. That's not a technology problem. That's a business model problem. It's the kind of problem that the Israeli team would never have been able to figure out. Yet the Brazilian knew how to do it, and he did it. And he's been the one who's scaling the company, basically. So now this is a company that is a Brazilian-Israeli company built on the strengths of both sides. And this could be a global company doing this both in developing countries and richer countries. And the last one I'll point out is M-Pesa. I think this is critical to understand the new geography of innovation. Because, you know, I was in Kenya a while back, and I was there for a meeting at a resort that was 20 minutes flight by small plane from Nairobi. It was in the middle of nowhere, you know, sitting on the edge of the Rift Valley, which it was funny to be, you know, in Kenya, the Rift Valley goes all the way up through Africa and then into the Dead Sea that's right by Israel. So here is at the other end of the Rift Valley, very, very far away from Israel. And I had 1 hour to do a safari. And my guide was a guy named Solomon. And he had lived in a village that was about 3 hours walk away from there. He had never been to Nairobi himself, let alone outside of Kenya. He didn't have any electricity in his village. He didn't have any bank account or credit card. But he had a cell phone, and he had coverage where he was. He could make calls. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't a fancy iPhone like this, but it was just a simple phone. But he had 2 SIM cards in the phone, and actually I noticed there were ads in Kenya for phones with 4 SIM cards in the same phone. That was kind of unusual. So he had 2 SIM cards in his phone because everybody has lots of SIM cards, so you have cheaper calls to, you know, to each company. He had Airtel, and he also had Safaricom. He had to have Safaricom because Safaricom had something called M-Pesa. And M-Pesa allowed him, with his simple phone, feature phone, to buy things, to move money by text message. He could get paid, he could buy something on the street, he could pay, you know, move money to his family. Instead of carrying around just a few years ago, people would carry around piles of cash on buses for hours. Now they just send it around by text message. And most of the economy is going through M-Pesa. Now, I have this iPhone, and all I can do is pay for parking with this in Startup Nation. I can't do what Solomon can do in Kenya with his text messages, and you can't do it here either. So basically what's happened is that Kenya is farther ahead in mobile payments than the United States, than Europe, than Israel. This is called leapfrogging. This is called taking the fact that you don't have all kinds of infrastructure, that you're behind 50 years in your banking system, and turning it into an advantage. Because in most countries, wherever they've been trying to do M-Pesa in more advanced countries, the banking system kills it. You know, the banking system comes along and says, well, you know, how could telecoms do banking? They're not allowed to do that, and it doesn't go anywhere. So, you know, I think that this kind of leapfrogging is going to happen in a lot of areas. It's going to happen in education, where kids who don't have schools and don't have teachers are going to be able, over the internet, to teach themselves how to code, how to do anything, and maybe do a better job of teaching themselves than we do in our universities. So there's going to be a huge leapfrogging in education, I think. There's going to be leapfrogging perhaps in infrastructure, where some countries are skipping landlines and going direct to cell phones. That's happened. They're also kind of skipping PCs and going directly to phones and tablets in terms of internet. I mean, a lot of the next billion people in the world are probably not really going to know what email is, because they're going to get internet directly through their phone or tablet, and they're never going to use email. So, you're going to see this kind of leapfrogging everywhere, and what this means is that more and more the startups that are going to grab our attention are going to be from somewhere else. They're not going to be from Silicon Valley. They may not be from Israel. And here in Latvia, you have to realize that this is the game that we're all in. So I want to end. I said that size is very important, and that for Israel, our size has been, normally you would think of it as a disadvantage, but it's become an advantage. And that's because when you think about Israeli companies, if you're an Israeli startup, a company in most countries, you start with the local market, and then you go to the regional market, and then you go to the global market. In Israel, we basically have no local market because we're so small. We've been cut off from the regional market, so we've had to think global from day one. And I think, Latvia, of course, is integrated into the regional market increasingly through the Eurozone and so on. And yet, even historically, you have been, cut off somewhat by language, by culture from the region around you. And you're certainly a small country that can't rely on its local market. So that's an advantage. It's very hard for companies in big countries to think globally. Imagine a company in China trying to think globally when they've got the enormous market that they're sitting in. It's very hard. So here in Latvia, it's actually an advantage to be small. And I think that what you have to keep in mind is that small is not only global, but that these kind of innovations can come from everywhere, anywhere. There's no reason why it can't be Latvia. There's no reason why Latvia can't be an innovation leader. There's no reason why the next Skype or